I think that it is very easy to tell a story about one's life, but I don't view my life as a story. I see theme and story merely as a way for humans to pass down culture such that we don't have to reinvent the wheel every time. And that story becomes the way with our limited senses to be able to grasp and transmit very complex ideas. So I think it's really incredible that the human brain has evolved to use story in such a profound way that we've literally optimized our brain to see the world from the perspective of a story. But I don't, in the practice of my life, I don't feel like I'm living a story. Now, when I go to communicate it to other people, obviously I translate it into a story, but that's not my experience.
Some people would argue that potentially at this juncture, hearing you speak about detachment comes from a place of the privilege of having achieved all the things that you've wanted to achieve. How do you instill lessons like this in individuals that haven't had the same life experiences that you have had?
Well, so that would be a fundamental misunderstanding of what actual monk level detachment is. Monk level detachment is, I could starve to death and that would be fine. It just is what it is. And the ability to separate pain from suffering is a really fascinating part of the human mind. Again, I am not saying that I have achieved that. I have not. And so like anybody, if I found myself out on the street, I'd be like, well, this really sucks. But I know that that is a trick that my mind is playing on me. I don't know how deep and philosophical we want to get here. And I do not want anybody to lose sight of the fact I am very grounded in the same reality that they are all grounded in, for better or worse. However, I find it very fascinating that we are having a biological experience, and I do not fool myself that my pain and suffering is born of biology, which is these evolutionary destinations, or at least sort of transient pass-through moments, where to keep me alive long enough to have kids, my brain is a certain way. And the very fact that pain and suffering are two different regions of the brain that you can turn off selectively is utterly fascinating. So really mild case of this, I was in New York just a couple days ago, and we ended up walking quite a distance, and it was very cold. And my wife was worried that, long story why, she wanted to walk, I didn't, but we ended up walking, and she was like, oh, I hope that this doesn't end up being like super lame for you, because I don't want you to have a bad time just because I want to do this thing. And I was like, no, this is perfect. This gives me a chance to detach suffering from pain, because she was dressed more warmly than I was. So I was like, look, I am going to be cold, and that is going to give me a pain signal, but I'm not going to suffer at all. And so we can take as much time as we want. This is good practice to remind myself that these two things are separate. And it's utterly fascinating, man. It really works. So there are limits. Of course, if I was being tortured, I would be freaking out and I would be in all kinds of suffering. And I'm sure I would come to the conclusion that, hey, it works for monks and I'm not there yet. But nonetheless, keeping that in my back pocket to know that if my life ever got to the point where I'm like, ooh, I don't know that this is worth it, then to earn my own respect, I would play that final card.
Talking about, thank you for delineating that out. I think that's really profound. Interestingly, you interview a lot of different people. I'd love to get your take on where we are right now as collectively as a society to some degree as well, because I've heard, this was, I'm sure it's a common colloquial, but I heard it first said by you, which was, and I'll let you say it actually, tough times create good men, so on and so forth, and then eventually we end up with weak times. Can you give us that, and then tell us where you think we might be in the whole stage of everything?
Yeah. So, okay, this is very much not something I came up with, but I don't know who did. So we're both reaching into ether with this amazing quote. So it goes, hard times create strong men create good times create weak men create hard times, and then you loop back around. We are very much living in the weak man moment of history. So we had 70 years of unprecedented peace and prosperity in the West. Obviously, this is not global, but in the West, we just had an unprecedented run post-World War II. Really been incredible. You could, number go up in the stock market with minor blips. In the Western world, education rates rising, people yanked out of poverty. I mean, just like every metric you could want to see. And even globally, the amount that we've reduced poverty is unbelievable. I mean, just absolutely unbelievable. I don't want to be blind to the fact that there are still people suffering and there's wars happening right now. But oh my Lord, when you really step back and look at history, bro, like if you want to get into history, like some really dark, evil things have happened in history. We're just outside of that, certainly regionally in the West, but even at a global scale, way better than it's ever been. So that is inevitably going to create people that are soft. And you're getting what people would call luxury beliefs now, where it's like, yeah, you can believe that when the world is safe and stable, but you're not going to be happy with the outcome of that when your country gets invaded. And I doubt very much that your audience is into anything political, but you can really see the bifurcation in politics. And so there really is a fascinating evolutionary divide between the left and the right that I think people would be very wise to understand. So if you look at creating a creature that is able to, more than any other creature on planet Earth, is able to cooperate in extremely large groups flexibly. That's the important part. Extremely large groups flexibly, right? So ants, extremely large groups, not flexibly. They've got a role, they do the role, that's it. And so we're able to use story and things to unite us to work in these incredibly large groups. But the way that we get there is very different than anything that you're going to see anywhere else in the animal kingdom. And so people can get themselves in trouble if they don't understand the nature of the human mind in that. If you understand that for us to come together in these large groups, we have to have the storytelling, but we also have to have a tension between the left and the right. And so the tension looks like this. On the left, you've got the no man left behind, right? Compassion, we want to make sure that everybody's okay. The problem is game theory tells you that if you're always looking out for the other person, you're going to get something called a free rider. And so this is known as the free rider problem. And that's where the right comes in. And the right is about personal responsibility. And either one of them alone becomes pathological. And so what we've seen as we get into weak times is a pathological leaning to the left, where it's all compassion. It's don't chastise people for doing drugs, like just make sure that they have clean needles. That's just deranging. So you need the right to step in and say, hold on, people need to take personal responsibility. People need to get off drugs. You're not going to be able to contribute to the group if you're over here doing drugs and you're expecting us to give you money and resources and all of that. Like, that's crazy. So, but the right on its own becomes pathological, becomes totalitarian. So you need this balance in the friction between the left and the right. And what you see, unfortunately, is people on the left are thinking everybody on the right's evil, and the people on the right think everybody on the left is evil. And so now you get these warring factions as the tribes move farther and farther apart. And so getting people to understand that it's really the friction that makes this work becomes incredibly important. And that's what's missing in this moment. But yes, very much born out of the good times make weak men moment, because you can afford to say, no, like, just make sure they have clean needles. But you can't afford that. You go back 200 years, man, we're like fighting for survival.
Hey there, Inspired Evolutionary. If you absolutely love this, well then here's a full conversation with this guest on the Inspired Evolution podcast. Check it out now.